Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and natter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're going to look at Namor, the avenging son of Atlantis. Or is he? Before I address that leading question, let me just say we're talking about Namor first because he was first. Namor appeared in April of 1939, where Aquaman wouldn't show up on the radar until November 1941. Namor was created by William Blake Everett, who would also help create the Marvel characters Zombie and, more famously, Daredevil. Now, Mr. Everett didn't create Namor for Marvel because Marvel didn't exist at the time. He was working for a company called Funnies Incorporated, which was a comic book packager, which was a company that made comics to order for publishers. It's a weird setup, and they created the first Marvel comics, which kind of spun off and turned into their own company. Comic book packagers are no longer a thing. Comic book companies kind of do their own publishing. I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds on this, though, because it's easy for something like that to turn into its own video, and we already have a lot to talk about. So back to Namor. Namor is a foundational character in Marvel Comics, not just because he's been around so long, but because he can hook into so many different groups. And I can say that despite not being a very huge Namor fan myself. Let me give you some examples. So, Namor is often cast as a supporting character or even an antagonist to the Fantastic Four. One of his big appearances in the 60s is him invading New York and the Fantastic Four fighting him off, right? He's also hooked into the X-Men because he is Marvel's comics' first mutant. He's first because he was the first mutant to show up in the books. He's a mutant because his father was human and his mother was a submariner. That's actually the official name of the race before they became Atlanteans. I'll get into that. And he also has the mutant ability to fly because of those little wings on his ankles. Yes, that is canon. That's official. What do you want me to tell you? He can also be hooked into the Avengers because this is somewhat of a retcon. This didn't happen in the first run, but in the official history of Marvel, he joined with Captain America and the first Human Torch to form an anti-Nazi superhero team, and him and Cap are kind of war buddies, which interesting in of itself, right? So Namor can move around in a lot of different superhero circles, and he can serve different functions. He can be an antagonist. He can be a protagonist. He can be a supporting character. He can be a mentor. He can do a lot of things. So you can understand why it's hard to pin down a definitive Namor story arc where I say, yes, this is the big story arc that says this is who Namor is and this is what Atlantis is in Marvel. In the end, I ended up turning to my patrons for help. One of them got me in touch with the blogger Imperialist Rex, who I will be linking to in the description below, who basically explained to me if I'm looking for a definitive Namor and Atlantis story, there isn't one. And there are a lot of good reasons for this. Namor, in most of his appearances, is coded as being an outsider. In his original appearance, he's coded as not white, partially due to his features. It's remarked many times in the comics that he has an East Asian cast to his features in some ways, due to being able to live underwater, and mostly the fact that he was brought up in a non-white culture. His mother is blue, and they have nothing to do with European culture. So you could and likely should consider him something of a biracial character, which is also something Imperialist Rex pointed out to me, and I'll be linking that entry in the description as well. But most of his iconic stories take place with him dealing with the surface world alone without Atlantis, and there's a reason for this. That reason is Namor was never meant to be an Atlantean. Mr. Everett himself said he didn't want to write Namor and his people as Atlanteans. In his original origin, Namor's people are living near Antarctica, and in the comic books, Atlantis isn't even mentioned until 1949, a good 10 years after Namor has been kicking around, invading the surface world, fighting Nazis, and generally causing as much trouble as he fixes. So Atlantis is an add-on, a later addition to Namor's story, a rather complicated one in a legion of complications. For example, I mentioned Namor's relationship with other superheroes and the surface world is kind of complicated because he's an outsider. He's not really a member of the superhero community, but he's also not entirely Submariner or Atlantean, so he's forced to stand between these two worlds, and that's what drives his character in a lot of ways. Namor is also royalty, and his first loyalty is to the underwater nation he belongs to, whether we call it Atlantis or something else, but because his father was human, he's also tied to the surface world, whether he wants to be or not. And some of his best stories play on those issues where he has to navigate this messy tangle of relationships and emotions and experiences. And although he clearly identifies and embraces his underwater side, as I'm going to call it, because that's where he was brought up, and he gets to be a king there, so I kind of see where he's coming from, deciding that he's, a Submariner or an Atlantean or whatever we're going to call it. Another issue is that Atlantis isn't really well tied into the Marvel setting, not the way it is in the DC setting that we'll be exploring next week. One reason for this, not a huge reason, but a reason, is that Marvel got the rights to Conan through much of the 70s and 80s, and they made great Conan comics, don't get me wrong, but they also tried to tie the Hyborian age of Conan into the mainstream timeline. It's not a huge deal, it doesn't come up very often, but it does get awkward in those periods where they lost the rights and suddenly had to dance around things, which leads to retcons and rewrites and just plain not dealing with the fact that Cole is sometimes a Marvel character and sometimes isn't, and he had his own Marvel character comic series and is from Atlantis. So Atlantis has a bunch of different treatments and origin within the Marvel comics, and it's left really incoherent. And this is where legalism and copyright can really hamper a creative work, but it is what it is. Now, Marvel, in my humble opinion, has done more interesting and complete work with Lemuria in some ways, making it the homeland of the Deviants, which is a thing we're not going to get into because, oh my god, that's complicated. If you really want me to look at the deviants of Marvel Comics someday, leave a comment, join the Patreon maybe and call for it there, but I'm just going to leave it here for now to keep us from being here all day. Considering all of this, when we look at the movie Wakanda Forever and the decision to remove Atlantis from Namor's origin and story, I feel like we're more returning to what Mr. Everett, that original creator, intended. The idea to use a Mesoamerican take on the idea of a underwater kingdom is great as far as I'm concerned as well. And, I mean, there is some irony there given the video on the lost continent of Mu, but we're going to leave that alone. As for how it was executed in the movie, I'm going to be honest, guys. I'm woefully behind on my media consumption. I haven't seen the movie yet, so I have no opinion on the execution. I'm interested, but I have a day job. I do all my own research, video editing, and there are other activities. So some things get left by the wayside, and one of those is watching movies. I'm not complaining. I do this video series because I enjoy it. Hopefully you're enjoying listening to it, but just facts of life. There's only so much time in the day. Getting back to Namor. Namor and Atlantis, in my view, are an uneasy union to start with, so splitting them up is likely a good idea. Just because you have an underwater kingdom doesn't mean it has to be Atlantis. Now, that said, I hope Marvel keeps doing Lemurian stuff, because that would be interesting. Okay, so this video is going to be short and hopefully sweet. I'm going to tell you to go read the blog of Imperialist Rex in the link below and tell him I sent you. That said, I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All of these really help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to support this channel, consider joining the ranks of my ever-wise patrons, because doing so does get you access to extra content. There's a video about my feelings on Plato's Republic, Call. Earlier, there was a long discussion about the Minority Report, things like that. And you also get to vote on polls of upcoming content, and you get to do all of this for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of which, special thanks to Big Steve, who remains my biggest literal and metaphorical supporter. Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. So, we are coming ever closer to the end of Hot Atlantis. Some of you are asking why it's still Hot Atlantis summer. Well, that's because I live in Arizona and it's still over 100 degrees here. But first, we're going to look at Aquaman. Next week, I discuss Aquaman in general, and we're going to talk about the Atlantean Chronicles, which is an Aquaman story. And after that, we're going to look at the Aquaman movie. And after that, we're going to wrap up Hot Atlantis summer with a look at Disney's Atlantis, which I know many of you have been waiting for. Hopefully you join me for all that, but until then, look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, keep reading.